afternoon. I'm Nicole Kanayurak. I'm representing ICC, but I'm also working with the Nursel Department of Wildlife Management. And today I'm going to be discussing, so yesterday we wrapped up with questions on ecosystem-based management in management, and we continue the session on case studies and steps towards implementation. And I'll discuss the implementation of EBM and co-management, and particularly draw from my research on the case study of polar bear co-management in the two LMEs off Alaska. So when we talk about living marine resources, we touched a little bit yesterday about biodiversity conservation efforts like polar bear co-management by Alaska Natives and the federal government, and it may require restructuring research and policies given climate change. So for polar bears, a co-manager involved in polar bear co-management and conservation said the question is not if polar bears should be conserved, but how polar bears should be conserved. And with an EBM framework, this can help co-management, even though it's management of a single species. And so, in a report to the Alaska Scientific Review Group in 2006, there was a statement mentioned that the only evidence that the Chukchi stock is decreasing is that the Alaska Native harvest has declined 50% since 1992. And what does that mean for stock assessments? So in my research, I analyzed the structure and the dynamics of the social system of polar bear co-management and how it affects the ecological system and Alaska Native peoples within these systems. So when we discuss EBM, as discussed in the EA concept paper by the Arctic Council, we look at the state of the ecosystem and create ecological objectives to manage human activities. And we make choices for management based on societal needs and with an intent to do so in an equitable manner. So while this case study is based on a single species, I would like to remind you of Carolina's discussion on indigenous knowledge and food security, and one of the components within the food security framework was the need for co-management. And so I would also like you to challenge you to think about the institutional setup within the respective states in which these species are co-managed, whether it's walrus or polar bears or seals or caribou, and the relationship or the framework within co-management with which Alaska Natives or indigenous people are involved. So for the polar bear, the 1973 Agreement on the Conservation of Polar Bears states that there is a need to protect the ecosystem. But while today, the approach is to minimize impacts where possible. So what does that mean in managing human activities? So in my research and for co-management, a primary focus is subsistence and human-bear interactions. And I would look at this question is this an equitable approach? So the primary threat to polar bears is the decline of sea ice loss due to climate change, but according to the Fish and Wildlife Service, there is an inadequacy of existing regulatory mechanisms to address climate change impacts on polar bears. So learning from the ecosystem-based management approaches, one of the EBFM goals, or the fisheries management goals, is to integrate different management policies to better act within a changing climate. And this is a process and not an endpoint. So what I have here is a graphic of what management looks like for polar bears across scales. And we've discussed and touched on scales a little bit. And for the polar bear species, here we can see that management is cross-scalar, and there are multiple organizations involved in communicating in co-management of polar bears. So, however, I find that the direct co-management relationship for polar bears in Alaska between the Alaska Native Commission and the Fish and Wildlife Service has a one-on-one relationship, and there needs, with an ecosystem-based management framework in mind, there needs to be consideration of other actors within the system and what other human activities can be managed beside it, that can be co-managed by Alaska Natives and the Fish and Wildlife Service. And different actors and relations affect co-management. So the relationships, the transboundary relationship with Canada can affect it in a different way than the transboundary relationship with Russia. So an ecosystem approach in the Arctic is particularly valuable because it is a systematic approach to reach across different mandates, whether federal, state, or societal, or international, to manage an individual species. And for co-management, as communities participating in many different co-management agreements on individual species of marine mammals, there is a value to have a comprehensive approach and framework to fill in the gaps and better inform management decisions by integrating various management policies and to consider the rapidly changing climate. And so this approach is particularly in line with Indigenous knowledge and ways of management and helps communicate science into management and create a holistic understanding while concentrating on living marine resources. So I find that there's opportunity there for even more relations across living marine resources that Indigenous people depend on. So polar bear co-management has social, ecological, and political dimensions across scales of the social ecological system, but there are barriers to implementation of co-management across scales, and this needs to be considered. So in my research in discussing polar bear co-management with co-managers involved, a co-manager stated that having to let go of the polar bear should not happen if conservation of polar bear means conservation of the ecosystem. So in order to improve the work across scales, there needs to be monitoring of agreed upon plans and tools for the process to help guide co-management. And because co-management, conservation initiatives may benefit by reaching beyond the direct habitat if the primary impact derives beyond the direct habitat, and which is climate change. So the process of conducting polar bear research needs more support in areas of research, and needs more support in the areas of research needs identified should be scoped out and tracked to be able to apply this science more effectively. So Moore and Huntington point out that there's a potential to use resilience scenarios for Arctic marine mammal management as a framework that may contribute greatly to the governance of marine mammals in a responsible manner. And so Metcalf et al., so Bear Metcalf and them recommended a while back ago to use the Human Ecological Systems Framework analysis with the case study of the Walrus Co-Management Institution to elaborate in a holistic way that Native communities may understand better rather than the specific concentration on population estimates of walrus. So rather than focusing on population estimates of walrus, using an ecosystem-based management framework may be better in terms of managing marine species. So the process of conducting polar bear research needs so monitoring and evaluating the efficiency of the approach to conserve Arctic marine mammals are interlinked with problems deriving from the human system. require decision makers to consider where these problems derive and what it looks like for existing regulations. And so specifically, the timeline and process of implementation is an issue with polar bear co-management, and it creates tension to the point where parties may have have conflicts with where these tensions may be avoided within EBM framework in mind if there is multi-organization collaboration with using the flexibility within existing institutions, and to create monitoring tools and consider the equity of weighing human activities. So co-managers and participants may want to consider an approach to the process of conservation within EBM framework in mind that includes peoples and strategies across scales and drivers that are in line with the institution structure, given the need for built-in flexibility. So the creation of a monitoring tool and areas of improvement and recommendations include having multi-organization collaborations, the use of the flexibility with institutional structures, and to create monitoring tools to weigh the diverse array of human activities. And thank you.